of prayer. So can you share with us the importance and the power of prayer? And can you describe to us your habits, the shifts of prayer that you would do when you were incarcerated?
Beautiful, beautiful. What do you do when you are in a circumstance or a situation that's limited, restricted, small, toxic? You have to find a way to enlarge yourself. So in circumstances that seem to be so small and limited, and some perhaps at times perhaps dangerous and toxic, you have to become larger than the environment. And there wasn't any natural thing that I could do to make that happen. So I was already on a very powerful and intensive spiritual journey. I had a very rigorous spiritual routine, daily, weekly, monthly. But that changes when you're in prison and you're sharing the room or a unit, with 5, 6 other women. That changes when you're in one big room, depending on where I was, and you got 75 women in the same space. So how do I pray now? How do I tap into God when this one over here is under the covers doing God knows what with that one? This one over here is sniffing that one. This one over here is snoring. This one over here is playing games and talking loud. This one over here. And you're in an environment, that's contrary to everything that you know as peace and how I'm used to tapping in. So I had to go within, Brother Willie, and literally not just to pray, because there were circumstances and situations where I couldn't do it in the normal way. I became a prayer. I embodied prayer. So I became very intentional about everything I did. So if I was standing in line to get my underwear for the month, or standing in the line to go into the kitchen or the mess hall, because there's a whole lot of waiting in prison, right? I used that time, that silence, to meditate, to tap in, to pray. I would run 13.1 miles almost the last 2 years of the time that I was in prison, most days a week. I was getting awards in prisons for the number of miles I would run a month, hundreds of miles a month. And the inmates and the staff used to be in awe and wonder. And the inmates would see my shoes, and I was buying them so much, they would literally have holes in them. And they would say, girl, you are literally, your shoes are on fire. I used the time that I was on the track to tap in. That was my secret. That was my secret to becoming larger than my environment, staying aligned, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And also the thing that I was initially most angry with the God about and resistant, I was forced to use my powers to do miracles for other people.
Oh, yeah, we're going to get into that. Yo, listen. Powerful, sister. Powerful. You also talked about how another thing that you did, you mentioned how the value of the Final Call newspaper while you were incarcerated. Can you talk about that, how that was an aid for you as well?
Indeed, I ate the Final Call newspaper. Literally, when you're waiting for your mail, and where I was located in the prison, when they do mail call, there was usually twice a day when they did mail call. And when the particular CO would go through the list and they're calling out the names, in anticipation of it, sometimes we would see the mail clerk come from across the street, with the basket of mail. And then on the basket of mail, there were, other containers that held the mail. And I would look for the manila envelope, because sometimes, even though mail call wouldn't be for hours later, sometimes if I just happened to be crossing, you know, near the mail clerk that was coming from across the street to bring us our mail for the day, and I would see, you know, a manila envelope, I had hope and thought, well, oh, that looks like it's Final Call newspaper. That's, you know, my Final Call. And they would call Crow, Dillard Crow, and the Final Call newspaper. And we would oftentimes share our papers. If somebody else got Washington Post, New York Times, or whatever, some of the other inmates, if they happened to have gotten that, not everybody did, obviously, we would share. And when I would try to share the Final Call newspaper with the other women, I would, you know, reluctantly share my paper with them, but I started to let them read it first, because when I would read it, I would read almost every inch of it, to where I would have notes and markers that they would complain, say, girl, I can't even read this. What does that even say? You got an X on there, a circle on that, a triangle on that. So I said, okay, you got a minute to read this. I need this. Give them a time frame. Get it back to me and let them read it before I start marking it. I ate it. I lived it. It helped to keep me intelligent. It kept me spiritually aligned. That came about, I asked my mother to get me a subscription, and I had it for most of the time, most of the years that I was there. There were two sisters that at different times that were that I came to know that had some connection with the nation. And so because of their desire for the nation, and the prison had to accommodate their particular spiritual needs, they were kind enough to let me sit in on some of their times in the chapel area to listen to DVDs. And some of the DVDs were restricted. The prison still restricted some of the ministers' certain types of DVDs that they were supposed to have, and information. So I use it as a supplement. And the reason I asked my mom to get me that, once I knew officially what prison I was going to be doing most of my time in, is because before that, while I was going through, prior to even the trial, when you go through the level of warfare that I was going through, high level officials that I was fighting on multiple levels as an activist, and some more stuff, the little spiritual people weren't breaking me through. That wasn't no encouragement for the level of warfare I was going through. You feel what I'm saying? I didn't get comfort or insight. And frankly, dear brother, while my mother and I were illegally removed from one of my properties, and I was fighting and suing the city at the same time in my nightgown, we were in a temporary place together, surrounded by some of the stuff. While most of my other stuff I ended up having to let go after losing most of my previous to that real estate empire, if you want to call it that empire. Empire to me doesn't mean I was, you know, you understand what I'm saying. So when I was looking for meat, somebody that understood, I came across several lectures and videos. And one of the ones that I think I first came across was from brother Dr. Khalid Muhammad.
Wow.
Now, you got to have something like that when you're going through what I'm going through, and you're dealing with federal, state, local, the newspapers. You see what I'm saying? I met with former attorneys generals. I was meeting with Republican prosecutors. This was on civil stuff. And I was, you know, affecting systems and all kind of stuff. I can't deal with no low-level look. All I'm believing God for is to pay my insurance kind of religion. So I know Dr. Khalid understands the transition with the nation and this kind of stuff. But a lot of the videos I saw was when, you know, he was in direct alignment, and those that when he weren't. But his energy and power in calling the devil a devil. That blessed me. That fed me. So that necessarily connected me to other videos that would come up on the minister, Brother Nuri, those kinds of things. That's how I had a knowledge of, the nation. And I started to eat from even some of those videos. And I said, yeah, because everybody can feed me during those difficult times. But that's why I wanted her to get me the Final Call in the first place.
You have a dynamic story. I'm gonna keep putting this out there. You got to put it on. You got to put it in a book. You have a dynamic story. You on your time. What allowed you not to get caught up in this narrow-minded thinking that sometimes those of us who practice certain religious traditions, ideologies, get caught up in that prevents us from unifying or even just sitting down fellowshipping with one another?
Such an excellent question. And it's so yummy. It's so yummy because it's written. Those that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Why am I talking about that? Those that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. The word exploits in the King James Version, at least, is in italics, which means it's not a part of the original where that text is listed. But when you look at the context of it and study it out, it means those that know their God shall be strong and take risks. But the know means intimate. So because I went on a for real journey with God, because I went deep spiritually without even initially knowing what I was doing or where it would lead to. Yes. Another text says, then there was the hiding of his power. Yes. He started to show me, started to show me things that were beyond the narrow and parochial interpretations or exegesis of scripture. I started to see multiple revelations of things. And it wasn't just multiple revelations, but it was dynamic. It was living. And as I was going from court to court, and as I was engaged in the stuff that I was engaged in, my relationship, and let's just use this word, my spiritual powers started to become more pronounced. And that had nothing to do with some dogma. That had to do with something I discovered in my relationship, you see? So that, I believe, helped to open me up, because once I engaged the God, he wasn't as limited as I was initially led to believe. It does not mean that they were entirely wrong either. It was good. It was informative. And there's a level of truth to some of that, but it's more. It's absolutely more. So that made me, I believe, more open and susceptible to that. And I'll say this about my grandmother too. My grandmother really was a scholar. She started one of the first libraries in our church, funded it, spent time at the public library learning how to set up library systems and to repair books. And she's mostly funded most of the books that were in the little room in New Prospect Missionary Baptist Church. But my grandfather's bedroom was filled, number one, with books. On the left side of their entire bedroom, there were books in our hallway as you would come in. And there were Bible circles that were named after my grandmother. It was called the Corrine Evans Circle. My mother was a Sunday school teacher. My grandmother was a Sunday school teacher. But my grandmother kept the Quran in her library, Brother Willie. My grandmother, when she would go traveling out of state, she would bring different books. But that doesn't mean she would tell folks Wednesday night Bible study, big to you Sunday, and all that. Doesn't mean she was going to tell the general population, the general public, that she used to. That you understand? Definitely. And so I think that was a little seed also that was sown, in my life, as well. I remember, I just remember those kinds of things. So I was always open. But when you engage the God for real, for yourself, you recognize and you realize quite a bit. It's more vast than you know, and it's not limited to that.
Wow, that's that. Listen, beautiful, because many people, sister, as you know, still are trapped in that box. So you touched on this. I heard you mention this in an interview, but you were about to touch on it, and I appreciate this about you so much. You kept it real in the interview that I saw, and you were about to get into it earlier about how there was a moment where you had some anger toward God based upon what you were experiencing. And some people act as if we don't have those moments, but you talked about how you overcame it. And it's a two-part question. I want you to talk about, that anger that you had about God, and maybe a three-part question, and how you overcame it, and whatever advice you can give to those who may be in that moment right now, be they Muslim, Christian, whatever, where they may be angry about God, but not being honest about it, even with themselves.
Yes. I'm going to sound repetitive, And I know, and again, I can't, of course, we can't see all the comments or anything, but I know that this interview is played on a few platforms and on Facebook and Twitter and wherever else, YouTube, and perhaps those later that might be watching. And it's not just about the number. Obviously, it's the quality of the individuals that are listening. And I want those that hear me to really, 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 really hear this. It sounds repetitive, but the way I could admit it with ease and overcome it, and it took some time, is because it's a for real relationship, which means it's a commitment. And I could be honest and knew God wasn't going to throw me away because of my honesty, because I'm in a real relationship. You feel me? So that's number one. And because of that commitment to the stuff that I'm made up of, when I went on my hunt for who I was, and when I went on my hunt to know God and my purpose, that was a commitment, you see? And so in relationships, you can be upset with your mom, right? In relationships, you can be upset with your spouse. In relationships, you can be upset, with your children. But there's a commitment, there's a connection. But what helped me to overcome it is my anger, my disillusionment, my shock. I was in disbelief even when I was being shackled, brother. When they black boxed me, shackled me, and I was on a plane and was in Kansas. When I was in Oklahoma, when I was in 3 or 4 different jails and so forth here in Colorado, even before they took me to these different states, and then ultimately Texas. When I was in each moment, it was like an out of body experience. I didn't have time to even really catch up with one thing, the other thing, because stuff was moving so fast and there was so much that wasn't known while I was still trying to appeal. You see what I'm saying? All these things were happening. And so because it was a commitment and because it's a true relationship, instead of it driving me away and I'm out of here, God, it pushed me further to the spirit to inquire, what is this? I pressed in further. I gazed harder. I meditated more. I began to embody this thing, everything that happened, every movement, every little thing. What is this? It drove me to that. So in my anger, in my hurt, in my whatever, it wasn't the hurt that I'm done, God, fully. It wasn't. But I'm reminded of Jeremiah. I don't know if those that are listening are familiar with this passage. Jeremiah the prophet. By the way, that was the same text that I got as a little girl. A lady came to my house and said, when I was a child, a young girl, and my mother was there in the kitchen, my grandmother was there in the kitchen, and she shared a word that she said was from the Lord for me. It was the same as Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1, when you said that Jeremiah was called to the nations and that you would speak. And I was a child, and she said, this was a word for you. Jeremiah said something later about God. He says, God, every time I open up my mouth for you, every time I do this, I get in trouble. And Jeremiah made a commitment to God and said, you know what? I'm not even going to speak for you. I'm done. I'm good. But then what did he say later? But your word is just like fire. Shut up in my bone. I can make the decision. I said I wasn't going to do it. But this thing that you and I have been engaged in, I'm so committed. I so embody my assignment and holy mission and the spirit for which I'm deployed to this planet for. When I say I'm not going to do something, you see, when the occasion, the moment arrives, I go against what I feel, what I said in my head. And he says, but your word is just like fire, shut up in my bones. And the thing that I said I wasn't going to do, I end up doing for God because it overtakes me. So I was too deep in, brother. God had invested too much you know, even at the moments, I said, this ain't even, this right here ain't it. But I had already deposited and invested so much time in spirit. He laid claim to me. And certainly it was a situation where, who says to the potter? Who you gonna say to the potter? What are you making?
Beautiful, beautiful response. And I love